What's up, everybody? It's your boy, everybody up. What's everybody? It's boy up. What's your everybody boy? Boy, it's your what's it's everybody. What's your everybody boy? It's boy up. Your everybody what's boy? Your it's boy, aka Reed from Shameless Nerd. Today's video is about a poem. If you watch some of my other videos and would like to support the channel, or if you want to make sure you don't miss any future uploads of me complaining about obscure animated movies from 2016, or about why thinking about death is important, or about why Andrew Jackson is the weirdest president we've ever had, you know, normal things like that, the best way to do that is to click the subscribe button below. You can even click the join button and join these current members of the channel and support me directly as I continue to try to preach empathy and nuance and authenticity in a world increasingly run by AI chatbots. Also, dropping a like on this video if you end up liking it would be greatly appreciated and is a big help. All right, let's get into it. I am an English teacher. I was, as all English teachers are, a massive dork in high school. I liked writing essays. I liked discussing the horribly dry short stories we were forced to read from the giant textbooks in my literature class. I liked diagramming sentences, for Christ's sake. And that carried all the way through to my begrudging adulthood. And now, above all else, I love a very cliche, overtaught poem. A poem that has become so ubiquitous that it is often randomly framed in old people's bathrooms all over the country. So deeply ingrained in American culture that it has become a point of emphasis in the way that parents preach to their children about doing the right thing. I am, of course, talking about The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Now wait, don't click off this video, please. I remember reading this poem in 8th grade, and then in high school, and then importantly, which I'll get to in a second, again in undergrad and college. And every time we read it and discussed it throughout secondary school, as I'm sure you will almost invariably remember as well, it was discussed with a certain shallowness that confused me. The poem was always read as a super straightforward, super dry and preachy poem about taking the road less taken, taking the high road, as it were. And it was taught to be a simple, pithy little poem about being individual in pursuit of moral purity. And, oh, if your friends were all jumping off a bridge, would you jump too? And you say, no, Mom. And she says, good, now eat your broccoli. And you say, but Mom, it's disgusting. You know you can make vegetables taste good, right? You can cook them in olive oil with garlic and spices. Vegetables don't have to be wet, steamed, springy little flavorless torture devices. And why was there an entire generation of adults making flavorful, hearty meals for themselves and then giving their children tasteless, raw baby carrots on a plate and saying, oh, eat this, that's good for you, and you have to eat it. And then your mom will say, well, no GameCube for you tonight. And you say, well, I'm gonna hold my breath till I die. And she dares you to do it because she knows that you can't, but of course you're 6 years old, so you take a breath and you hold it as long as you can, but then you inevitably have to take a breath, so you get uncontrollably angry at the dinner table and you hit her with 2 middle fingers because it's all you know what to do, and then you get a spanking and you get sent to bed. But importantly, you avoid having to eat any of those nasty ass vegetables. What was I talking about? The Road Not Taken always seemed suspicious to me as it was taught in middle and high school. It made me kind of hate poetry. I was like, if this is maybe the single most famous poem in American history and it's this boring and horrible, maybe poetry just sucks and is stupid. But I kind of filed it away in the back of my mind as like having to have something else about it. There's no way that this boring Puritan-ass poem would reach such great heights and infamy, right? And then in undergrad, I had a lovely, strange English 101 professor who collected paperclips and tiny books, whose name was Dr. Robertson, who not only opened my eyes to the subconscious suspicion I had always had about The Road Not Taken being valid, but also unintentionally to something that has guided my philosophy as a teacher and as a person navigating this world. I say this without a shred of irony or sarcasm. The Road Not Taken completely changed my life. And your middle school teacher was an idiot, and she believed that you too were an idiot, which is why we hate poetry. What the hell am I talking about? Well, first of all, not only is The Road Not Taken not about taking the high road, doing the right thing, making the right choice, it's kind of about the exact opposite. It's actually about the illusion of choice in the first place. It's about making peace with your life playing out exactly the way that it is. And if we're gonna sum it up with a cliche, it's much closer to wherever you go, there you are, than take the high road. It's also about ego and retrospection and personal narratives and so many things all at once and so cleverly. This poem is so good and cool and awesome, and it's being taught all wrong by uninspired middle school teachers all over the country and probably the world. So let's actually look at this poem, specifically and importantly, actually looking at the first 3 stanzas of it, the first 3 stanzas that everybody all but completely ignores in lieu of pretty much only talking about the famous 4th stanza. We'll look at it, I'll kind of briefly break down real quick just to make sure that we're all on the same page, and then we'll get into why this poem is actually so cool and interesting and why it changed my life and how it affects my personal philosophy about life and why it matters in the first place. The poem opens like this. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. So a narrator in the woods, he's at a fork in the road. He can't go down both roads at the same time, so he's trying to make a decision. He looks down the first one to kind of see what's up. Pretty simple so far. 2 roads, 1 choice, checking the first one out. And then took the other, as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. The second and third stanzas are vital to the meaning of this poem and often ignored. He says he looks down the second path as well in trying to decide which to take, and he says it's just as fair, and then spends the next 7 lines of an only 20-line poem going to painstaking lengths to establish that the 2 paths are exactly the same. They also both have been traveled. The passing there had warned them really about the same. There is no road less taken, and you didn't even notice that I just called the poem by the wrong title because we all do that all the time. The poem isn't called The Road Less Taken, it's called The Road Not Taken. The poem is about the concept of a road that isn't taken, yet both the roads in the poem are taken. The narrator then doubles down, saying that not only are the paths worn about the same, but also neither has been trodden on this day. The roads are the same, and no one has been down either one on this day that he's in there. So in the second most important line of the poem, the narrator just picks one, and then he acknowledges that it doesn't matter what road he's on. He says, knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. Initially, he says, I'll keep the first for another day, and then takes the second, but then he's like, well, way leads on to way, one road leads on to another, and I'll just keep going. And then we have the famous, completely misunderstood final stanza, which in print reproduction for nursing home bathrooms all over the country often leaves out the most important lines of the entire poem, the first 2. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. And then 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. The last 3 lines we all know, but what about those first 2 lines of the stanza? I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, blah, blah, whatever. In other words, I will be telling this with a condescending, arrogant sigh, talking about how smart I am years from now, lying to my grandchildren about how important that day in the woods was, and how that decision to take the less traveled road, the one that we know doesn't exist, made all the difference, and I'm such a genius. So, to simplify the poem narratively, a guy in the woods sees 2 paths that are exactly the same, so he just picks one at random. And then as he's walking down the road, he's laughing to himself about how one day he'll tell everyone he actually took the super awesome cool road that was way better, and I'm not like everyone else, and I'm so smart, and that will be funny. This poem is not about taking the road less traveled, it's about the idea that a road less traveled exists at all. And it's making fun of its narrator who believes in the road less taken. What the poem is really saying, the main message of the poem, the primary moral of the story, is that the road you are on, the path you choose to take, is the only path that exists. The decisions you make might feel important along the way, but the inability to make a decision stops your progress, and the path is ultimately the same either way. We will all end up where we're meant to be, and the apparent forks in the road along the path of our lives are an illusion, one that can derail us and hinder our progress towards self-actualization if we labor over them too much. Every decision you make changes the direction of the linearly forward progress road that is our lives. And my favorite, more subtle theme is the arrogance of rose-colored retrospection. We all look back on our lives and evaluate the paths we chose to take, pretending that those forks in the road along the way were what allowed us to get where we've ended up, and we're wiser and more cultured for it. But really, we're standing at those forks in the road looking down 2 paths that are indistinguishable, and in reality, way leads on to way, and we will end up exactly where we go, inevitably, invariably, and always. It is our human ego that inflates the value and wisdom of age and experience and gives us this unwarranted air of superiority in getting older. And that's something that I really love as a little sort of bonus theme in the poem. And this analysis of the poem isn't reading extra meaning into it or choosing a more interesting theme than the one we're taught in middle school. We can verify this because we know why the poem was written, specifically. Robert Frost wrote multiple letters of correspondence with his friend, Edward Thomas, who at first read the poem the way our middle school teachers did and said essentially, "Hey, Robert, this poem sucks," before Frost then had to explain to Thomas that he was misunderstanding, that the poem wasn't about that at all, and that in fact, hilariously, the poem Thomas was misunderstanding was actually written to make fun of Thomas himself. The two were friends, and Frost was often frustrated with Thomas's inability to make decisions, even seemingly minor ones, like, for example, choosing which path to take during a walk in the woods, which the two would do often and totally not kiss each other and stuff. Robert wrote the poem specifically to poke fun at his friend for not being more decisive and being insecure or whatever. Also, really not related to the specific video and what we're talking about specifically, but sadly, Edward Thomas actually wrote to Frost about the poem being a large inspiration in Thomas's decision to join the war effort, volunteering to serve his native England in World War I despite being old enough to avoid having gone. and then promptly died in action in France. So The Road Not Taken indirectly sort of killed the guy that it was written for. So why did this poem change my life? Was it this concept of linearity in life, this sense of inevitable progress and menial nature of seemingly important decisions along the path of life? No, it was about my middle school teacher thinking I'm stupid. I mean, the poem's cool, the meaning is great, I love it for that reason also, but this poem changed my life because in learning what the poem actually meant, I was unintentionally taught something much more important. Your teachers thought you were stupid. In fact, they thought you were so stupid that they robbed you of something really cool. And in doing so, they actually taught you something instead that was untrue and made you hate poetry. The real meaning and the real story behind The Road Not Taken is really cool and interesting and fun, but it's a pretty nuanced and complicated message. It's not easily packaged and pointed out to a group of 13-year-olds. I would know, I've tried to do it before. So instead of teaching the real message of this famous poem, teachers across America teach some bogus moral lesson about taking the high road. And kids across America learn that poetry is simple and straightforward and preachy and a tool for moral instruction, the same way that they're taught about all literature in school. From The Tortoise and the Hare in kindergarten being a vehicle for a lesson about staying dedicated and working hard, to The K in middle school being a vehicle for a lesson about learning to undo racial biases, to Beowulf in high school being a vehicle for a lesson about heroism and chivalry. I had two important epiphanies that stemmed from learning about The Road Not Taken's actual message. Number one, I had never realized and now believe that children are taught to hate reading by the very ambassadors of reading and their English teachers throughout school. When you're a little tiny kid, you love reading stories with your parents. My son begs me to read stories to him every night, and he's never satisfied when I tell him, no, buddy, we can't read a fourth book tonight. You have to go to bed. And I know that part of that is him manipulating me into letting him stay up later, but you get what I mean. Books and stories are awesome until you get into school and you learn that they're not. And all throughout school, we're taught to associate books and plays and poems with critical analysis and essay writing and discussion of the ways in which the story is actually not cool and fun, but instead another voice in the cacophony of voices throughout a child's life, desperately trying to teach them a life lesson. And as we learn to associate stories with miserable schoolwork labor and treat every story discussion like a secular Bible study, we learn to hate books. And if kids were allowed and encouraged to read for the sake of enjoyment, we'd probably end up with a lot more well-rounded lifelong readers than we have now, and we'd have a lot more kids doing well in English class. The other epiphany I've already kind of mentioned. It is that we are incessantly underestimated by our teachers growing up. They teach you, don't start a sentence with because or and, because it's much easier to teach that than it is to explain the complicated mess of introductory dependent clauses and deliberate stylistic writing and the value of breaking rules on purpose in certain contexts. They teach you that the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth and they worked together with the Native American tribes nearby and had a beautiful little coexistent life where they all ate corn at a big table together, because it's much easier to teach that than it is to explain the nuance of history and the complicated mess of bad guy tendencies that the American colonists actually exhibited. They teach you that oil and water don't mix in science class because it's much easier to teach that than it is to teach polarity and entropy to 7th graders. And they teach you that The Road Not Taken is about being a good boy when it's really about identity and the illusion of choice. And in doing this constant oversimplification, and sometimes being straight up dishonest, like the Civil War was about states' rights, yes, but states' rights to what, brother? In oversimplifying everything, teachers rob students of interesting information in lieu of moving at the rate of the lowest common denominator. And even more importantly, they indirectly and unintentionally teach kids that everything is binary and simple and straightforward. In our world, what we need is people who are comfortable with nuance, who can live in the gray area, who are willing to push themselves to see both sides, to figure out the truth, and to accept that everything is related and more complex than it seems, that events, concepts, and people are more complex than they seem. And so in my classroom, I have plastered all over the wall a very corny phrase that I got from some PSA about Down syndrome. Assume that I can, so maybe I will. And as a 7th grade teacher, I abide by that. I don't dumb things down for my students. I trust that they can handle and actually subconsciously crave complexity, that they're bored by the simplicity of their education, and that they deserve the whole picture. I teach to the brightest in the room because I believe that everyone is capable and deserves a chance to prove that they can do stuff, and that they never will if I don't give them the opportunity to do so. And when students don't get it, I'll slow down, I'll find another way to explain it. I work on it with students to figure out what they need to understand what we're talking about. But because of this, in my classroom, I talk fast, I use big words, I tell them the truth, I answer their questions, and I teach them the road not taken. Thanks for watching. See y'all next time.